Apos Audio and I have a continuing relationship. They loan me gear from time to time. Apos is an authorized dealer for all the products on their website from every brand they carry. But apparently not satisfied to sit on their heels and do what every other online retailer does, Apos last year started to produce their own gear. The first was headphone cables. The second was the headphones. This is the Caspian. It is a $500 handmade headphone designed in collaboration between Kennerton and Apos. The Caspian has received tremendous hype from the typical review community, with the usual praise every product seems to get nowadays. Apos recently loaned the Caspian to me. They're pretty late in getting this headphone out to me, but let's hope it was worth the wait. If you go to the Caspian homepage, you'll be regaled with the same flowery, poetic language as you would anywhere else about any other audio product. But Apos does give you a bit more info about their headphone than the vast majority of competitors. First and foremost, Apos actually provides frequency response graphs. This, combined with their descriptions of the headphones, give you an idea of the sound signature. So, in that respect, Apos has outdone the likes of audeze, hifi, Sennheiser, Head Audio, Focal, Meze, Fostex, Denon, Monolith, Sony, Grado, ZMF, and even Kennerton themselves. Funny how easy it is to stand apart from the pack. Anyway, Apos says that the Caspian was designed to make you smile, and definitely not to present the music as it was intended, or with utmost clarity. They unambiguously say that the bass is elevated, and that the treble is non-fatiguing. They claim that the mids are, quote, compelling, with a focus on realism and immersion, though that is gobbledygook word salad as far as I'm concerned. The Caspian has a few dips in the treble, which can easily be seen in the graphs they provide. Apos says that the drivers are dynamic with graphene-coated composite materials. Hey, remember when graphene was the rage? Last year. They say that the headphone can be easily driven by any device, but that's hardly a surprise. Dynamic drivers are not particularly difficult to push, and with an impedance of 33 ohms, it's not necessary to use an amp. Overall, Apos has done a very good job providing some meaningful information that their competitors do not. Just the inclusion of the FR graph, irrespective of its measurement accuracy, is something to be acknowledged. And the fact that Apos is more or less clear that this headphone has a colored sound signature is a breath of fresh air as far as marketing is concerned. Finally, a PR department is not blowing smoke about the amazing technicalities of their headphones. The Caspian is a striking headphone. It is unmistakable for anything else. Apos says that the Caspian's ear cups are handmade oak. They claim that each ear cup is matched, which should result in minimal variation. The ear cups are dark and have an obvious zebra stripe design. Like them or hate them, you simply cannot ignore them. The headphone uses wood, metal, and leather materials. There is very little plastic, and what I could find seems to be sturdy, thick, and clearly rugged. The ear cups have some vertical movement, but unfortunately there is no horizontal swivel. This might make perfect fit a bit difficult for some. The ear pads are memory foam. They are large, spacious, and made of sheepskin. The headband seems to be normal foam, but is thick and well padded. The Caspian comes with Kennerton's stock mini XLR cable. It terminates in 1/4 inch only. The cable is thick but transmits little microphonics. Unfortunately, the cable is also pretty stiff, and the 1/4 inch termination means you have to use a bulky 1/4 inch to 3.5mm adapter, or use another cable altogether. The Caspian also comes with Kennerton's standard leather carrying bag. It is thick, padded, and perfectly holds the headphones and cable. In all honesty, I'm a huge fan of the Kennerton bags. They scream premium and have a sensible use of space inside. You cannot say that for most alternatives. As for comfort, the Caspian has a strong clamp. It's not necessarily uncomfortable, but you will feel the pressure. The memory foam earpads do much to mitigate the feeling, but if you are sensitive to headphone clamping force, then this might be a problem. The headband does produce downward pressure, causing a slight hot spot, but otherwise is secure and generally comfortable. I can wear the Caspian for about 3 hours before needing a break. Overall, the build is phenomenal. This is a rugged, well thought out design. The accessories are quality. But not all is perfect. The lack of horizontal movement in the ear cups is an issue. Just an inch or two of swivel would be plenty, but we don't get that. Also, I'm perplexed why Apos agreed to use the standard Kennerton quarter-inch cable. If this headphone is to be used with phones and laptops, we should not be forced to use a bulky adapter or purchase additional cables. And, of course, no spare ear pads. While Apos has done a fairly good job in most areas regarding the build, I think they made some missteps as to the cable and lack of spare ear pads. I mean, this is a $500 headphone. To test the Caspian, I used it with the Army 80i2 DAC, Burson 3XR, and the Low-2PA S1. I used the stock accessories. I had to use a 3.5mm adapter for the S1. I listened to my test playlist on Amazon Music HD and Qobuz. True to word, the Caspian is really easy to drive. I tested this on my MacBook Pro M1. I rarely had to go above 50% volume straight out of the headphone jack. You do not need to worry about using an amplifier with the Caspian. If you don't have one, don't get one just for this headphone. Pumping ridiculous amounts of power, such as through the Burson, does nothing for driver performance. Apos says that the Caspian has emphasized bass. My tests indicate that that indeed is true. In Mountains by Hans Zimmer, there's a rumble from the beginning, which builds into a crescendo. The Caspian presented this detail. The rumble was a little louder than what I heard on the neutral audeze 4X. Transients was a little slower on the Caspian. When the crescendo hit, the Caspian made the organ meld with the other instruments. The rolling thunder effect was emphasized and overwhelmed the other elements. When the vocals chimed in, they rose from the background until they were about shoulder to shoulder with the instruments. In Conquered by Overwork, there's a rolling marble sound at the beginning. This pans from right to left to center. The Caspian presented the sound and some of the panning. There are multiple drums in this track, and the Caspian rendered them all similarly. In other words, the various drums all had hard impact, and each drum strike heavily melded with the next. I listened to several hip-hop songs including Pure Water, Newpatek, Reel It In, and Uproar. On each occasion, the Caspian easily presented the sub-bass and emphasized it. The subwoofer always sounded like it was at the other end of a small room. The vocals were about one step ahead of the instruments. They retained their sparkle. The drums were slightly louder than the sub-bass. Now listen to my Sicario playlist. I use these songs to determine if there's any audible bass distortion. Traversing from low to high volume, I could not hear any distortion. Overall, the Caspian has elevated bass. Sub-bass appears to get a fairly significant emphasis, while mid-bass has a more tame one. Separation of sub-bass from mid-bass is no better than average, I would say. Apos says that the Caspian has realistic and immersive mids. I don't know what that is supposed to mean. My tests indicate that the Caspian has forward mids with sibilant female vocals. In Ola Gartland's song Why Am I Like This, there is natural vocal grain and sibilants mixed into the track. The Caspian presented and emphasized both. This was patently obvious when I compared the Caspian against the more neutral Aventone Planar. The Caspian sibilants push was similar to what I heard on the audeze 4X. The Caspian sibilants and vocal grain emphasis was, I must guess, a few decibels. It was without doubt far, far less than the HD560S. Orla's voice was 1 to 2 steps ahead of the instruments. The drums were louder than the other instruments, but did not drown out the vocals. In Want You Back by Haim, the Caspian again showed that it slightly emphasizes vocal sibilants. This was similar to what I heard on the audeze 4X. At 8 seconds into the track, the primary singer says the word "we" and drags it out, making it sound gravelly. The Caspian rendered this detail. There are 2 backup vocalists, one in either channel. The Caspian initially presented all 3 vocalists clearly with their individual tonalities. However, when the instruments played at maximum, the backup vocalists melded into one voice. The drums, bass, guitar, and piano also all melded. The drums generally were louder than the rest. The vocals remained 1 to 2 steps ahead of the other elements. In Superposition by Young the Giant, the Caspian presented the ukulele, drums, and bass, but the drums were a little louder than the others. All instruments melded their notes together slightly. The primary male vocalist was 1 to 2 steps ahead of the instruments. His vocal sibilants did not appear to be emphasized. There's a backup vocalist whose voice is layered beneath the primaries. Most headphones cannot reveal this subtle detail. The Caspian could not either. Between 1 minute and 10 and 1 minute and 20 seconds, there are sharp intakes of breaths. The Caspian presented this detail. Overall, it seems that the Caspian has slightly forward mids. Female sibilance is marginally emphasized. Vocals are generally 1 to 2 steps ahead of instruments. There's about average clarity in the mids region. Apos says that the Caspian has airy treble. My tests indicate that the treble is slightly rolled off. In Scherzo for X-Wings, the Caspian presented the brass and horns clearly. Their nasally signatures were easily audible. However, the higher pitched notes seemed a bit recessed, less loud than what I heard on the more neutral Aventone planar. The timpani was marginally emphasized, but it did not drown out the other instruments. The Caspian has some width, but no depth or verticality. In other words, sometimes instruments seemed further out into the wings, but none sounded like they were deeper into the room, and no sounds came from above or below. In Flight from the City, the Caspian made the piano sound like it was about 5 feet away. Its bassy notes were emphasized, and each note melded with the next. The cello was as loud as the piano and sounded, for the lack of a better terminology, smooth. Both instruments melded the tonalities. I could hardly hear the pops and sizzles and electric buzzing effects, but I did hear the creaking of the wood in the pianist's bench and the shifting of the cello's weight. In Take 5 by the Dave Brubeck Quartet, the Caspian rendered the piano in the right, drums in the left, saxophone center, and bass 1 step behind. All instruments melded their tonalities, but none seemed veiled in the mix. The cymbals were as loud as the saxophone. The saxophone's higher-pitched notes were quieter, less energetic than what I heard on the Aventone Planar and Olo S4X. The cymbals are struck at different positions, which should result in varying tonalities. However, the Caspian made each cymbal strike sound the same. Overall, it seems to be that the Caspian has a treble roll-off near the upper treble region. I could not get the Caspian to sound harsh in any recording, even at high volumes. Apos warns us that the Caspian is not intended for detail retrieval. I would agree. This headphone will present the obvious details, but will struggle to render subtle or nuanced details. It is never that details are lost, but simply that the bass, if it is prevalent in a mix, will overpower other elements. There's also about average separation among elements in a given track. Creaking of wood, shifting of a cello's weight, sharp intakes of breaths, multiple vocalists, twangs of guitar strings, nasally signatures of brass and horns. These types of details are clear. But layered details, or those that are mixed in a bit more quietly, will be much harder to hear, I think. For a more quantitative test, I use the song New Light by Kazuki. This track has layers of details including the sound of children playing, wind, rustling of grass, synth, piano, and footsteps. I count the number of footsteps I can hear in the first 60 seconds. The Sennheiser HD800S presents 22 footsteps, the Focal Clear, 18. The Austrian Audio HiX65 presents 16 to 17 footsteps. The Austrian Audio HiX55 presents 16. The HiX15 and X25BT each present 13 to 14 footsteps. The hifi Metsundara, Aventone Planar, Sifka Phoenix, and Birdemic DT1990 present 10 to 11. The Monolith M1070, M1570, Sifka Robin, and Ultrasound Pro 1480i all provide 8 to 9. The audeze LCD2 Closed and LCD2 Classic each provide 7 to 8 footsteps. The M1060C provides 7 footsteps. The audeze LCD1 and HD6XX presents 6 to 7. The Neumann NDH20 presents 5 to 6 footsteps. And the Caspian rendered 7 to 8 footsteps. On my scale of detail retrieval, the HD6XX and LCD1 are the average performers. Any headphone that provides more or less detail is judged accordingly. So the NDH20 would be considered below average and the hifi Metsundara as squarely above average. Here, based on this scale, I think the Caspian has slightly above average detail retrieval. Apos does not say how we should compare the Caspian soundstage. In my experience, it seems that the Caspian has average soundstage. Some people think that just because a headphone is open back, that fact alone will render wide soundstage. That's not true. The tuning, damping, music, and adequate power to the drivers are all competing factors. There are some closed-back headphones that have wider soundstage than open-back headphones. It all just depends on the circumstances. Here, the Caspian does not present wide soundstage, at least not in the typical sense. If you come from Beats or Bose headphones, then yes, you could say that the Caspian is wide-sounding. But compare it to other audiophile headphones and the experience is different. I have a soundstage scale. Once again, I use the HD6XX and LCD1 as my average performers. Headphones that have more or less soundstage than these two are judged accordingly. The audeze Mobius and all Beats headphones have claustrophobic soundstage. The NDH20 and ATH M60X have below average soundstage. The HD6XX and LCD1 have average soundstage. Pacifica Phoenix, Emotiva GR1, and Ultrasound Pro 1480i have average to maybe above average soundstage, depending on the particular recording. The Hi-Fi Mansundara, Aventone Planar, Austrian Audio Hi X55 and X65, and the LTD2 Classic have above average soundstage. The Hi-Fi Mandiva has wide soundstage, and the HD800S has super wide soundstage. In my opinion, the Caspian has soundstage that is similar to the HD6XX and LCD1. Apos says that the Caspian was designed for enjoyment, to put a smile on your face, as they put it. Well, that depends. It depends on your preferences, your music, and whether this is the sound signature you're looking for. Speaking of which, what is the sound signature? If you look at the Caspian FR graph, you can assume a bass emphasis, a more neutral rendition of mids, and a treble roll-off. My experience was not exactly what the graph suggests. The bass is definitely emphasized. This is not Beats or Bose level emphasis, but it is clearly beyond neutral. Both sub-bass and mid-bass have a push. There's average at best clarity in this region, and some bass bleed into the mids. The mids are slightly forward. Female vocalists are a bit sibilant, though not necessarily harsh. The Caspian does not present neutral tonality in this region. There's about average clarity and separation here. Vocals are 1 to 2 steps ahead of instruments. The treble is rolled off. The upper treble has a downward deviation. Higher pitched treble instruments do not sound as clear or as piercing as with more neutral gear. Clarity in this region is a bit more obvious than in bass or mids. The Caspian has slightly above average detail retrieval but average soundstage. This is, as you will probably have guessed, a balanced sounding headphone. I've read many reviews wherein people say that this headphone has a relaxed sound, an easy, not harsh presentation. I also thought this initially. But frankly, this will depend entirely upon your preferences and your music. While I am not more sensitive to sibilance than the average person, at least I think so, I can tell the difference between a headphone that emphasizes sibilance and one that doesn't. The Caspian falls within my personal tolerance level, but that is not a universal statement. Nor can it be said that everyone will enjoy the bassiness of this headphone, or the treble roll-off, or the average-ish detail retrieval and soundstage. The Caspian could be a great headphone for some, while a total waste of time for others. We need to do comparisons to figure out where new products fit in. True A/B tests are the only way to be sure, and even then, you have to do it yourself and have strict testing parameters. Here, we will compare the Caspian against the HD6XX and Sennheiser Audio Apollo. I used the stock accessories for all headphones. I plugged them into my passive AB switch. That switch was plugged into my RME 80i2 DAC. I listened to my test playlist on Amazon Music HD and Qobuz. I tried to volume match. The 6XX has noticeably less sub-bass emphasis than the Caspian. Separation of sub-bass from mid-bass is a little bit more clear on the 6XX. Transience is faster on the 6XX. Mid-bass impact is harder on the Caspian. The Caspian has greater bass bleed into the mids. The mids are closer to neutral on the 6XX. Both headphones place vocals ahead of instruments. However, drums are typically louder in the mix on the Caspian. Both put vocals close to the ears, and I think it's hard to say one is noticeably different from the other in this respect. The Caspian has a marginal emphasis of vocal grain and sibilance compared to the 6XX. Mid-centric clarity and separation of instruments is similar. The 6XX has a similar treble roll-off as the Caspian. Neither seems to accentuate the treble region, and both appear to slightly de-emphasize upper treble. The Caspian is marginally clearer and provides a bit more separation in the treble region. The Caspian has slightly more detail retrieval than the 6XX, but the same amount of soundstage as the 6XX. The Apollo has a sub-bass roll-off that is easily noticeable when compared to the Caspian. Transience is faster on the Apollo. Separation of sub-bass from mid-bass is easily more noticeable on the Apollo. Mid-bass impact is harder on the Caspian. The Caspian has greater bass bleed into the mids. Both headphones have forward mids. Both emphasize vocals. However, the Caspian has a marginal push in vocal grain and sibilance, while the Apollo is closer to neutral in that respect. Separation of mid-centric elements is noticeably clearer on the Apollo. All elements are closer to the ears on the Caspian. Treble is also fairly different. The Caspian has a treble roll-off, particularly in the upper treble region. The Apollo has seemingly neutral treble, at least in comparison. The Apollo has greater separation and placement of all treble instruments. The Caspian presents elements closer to the ears. The Apollo has greater detail retrieval. In my new light test, it rendered 8 to 9 footsteps. The Apollo has considerably wider soundstage. Comparisons like these help us figure out if the newest headphone is really hype-worthy. After all, last month's gear probably got the same amount of praise. And if you bought the audiophile community's favorite ice cream flavor from 6 months ago, should you really spend money again on this week's drug? Here, it is obvious that the Caspian has a very different sound signature from the competitors I reviewed. That's a good thing. This allows you freedom to choose among a selection of potential candidates. Ultimately, some or none of these headphones might be to your liking. I own two Kennerton headphones, the first generation Valley and the Magni. Both are built quite well, both have different sound signatures. But I think you would have your work cut out for you if you wanted to make the argument that Kennerton offers value. So, when Apos decided to partner with Kennerton, it seems on paper to be a bad decision. After all, deciding to collaborate on a headphone with a brand known for making expensive gear where both parties obviously get a cut from each sale would theoretically mean that the product would have to be expensive. Surprisingly, the Caspian is not the typical Kennerton price tag. As far as build is concerned, the Caspian is Kennerton through and through. It's built for tough. It's got premium accessories, and while not everyone will find it a comfortable headphone, it is a far cry from the likes of Beats or the One More triple driver. The Caspian has a balanced sound signature. The bass is clearly elevated, mids are forward, and there's a marginal emphasis in sibilance and vocal grain, at least for female artists. Treble has a roll-off. The Caspian has slightly above average detail and average soundstage. This brings us to value. At $500, Apos really has to explain why anyone should buy their headphone when there are so many good alternatives in the market. Why not the LCD-1, or the HD660S, or one of the Sendy or Sifka headphones? What about Hi-Fi Man with their robust selection? Well, the question is equally the following. Why those other headphones and not the Caspian? Frankly, the Caspian has a sound signature that is not easily found among audiophile headphones or IEMs. It just seems that a large number of headphones have aggressive emphasis in sibilance or treble. Yes, there are headphones which have a non-fatiguing presentation. For an example, you can look at the HT6XX, Avatone Planar, Sendy Apollo, Fostex T60RP, and some others. But the Caspian provides a sound that is different enough to stand apart. Warm, intimate, relaxed treble with a boosted bass that doesn't bloat or distort and clear vocals that do not sound harsh. The Caspian does not impress when it comes to technicalities, but Apos doesn't promise that anyway. So, is the Caspian value at $500? Yes, I think so. There's plenty here that's unique, build, materials, accessories, sound, to warrant this price tag. This does not mean that you will love the Caspian or that you should go out and buy it. It merely means that the Caspian is a perfectly good headphone. Whether you will like the fit, sound, or performance is another matter. And, as a side note, for those who have griped online about the frequency response graph for this headphone, have complained and poo-pooed the dips, I have only one thing to say. Get over it. Worry less about measurement perfection, and think more about what the manufacturer was trying to accomplish.